So it seems like when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2, people love moving the goalposts. First, it was going to be another Wii U situation. The Switch 2 sales proved I was wrong. And the new goalpost is now the Nintendo Switch 2 games aren't selling. Developers are mad and upset that they didn't meet their sales numbers. Really? What article said that? What source did that come from? Was that straight from the developers' mouths? Now listen, the Nintendo Switch 2 is the most sold console ever in 24 hours, especially within its 4 days launch window, right? The Switch 2 the original Switch sold 152 million. Now we all know, or for those of you all that don't know, if a system sold 152 million, the games itself aren't going to sell 152 million. The software never sells the same amount the console sold. That's just how it is, and that'll never change. You have 3.5 million Nintendo Switches in people's hands. How much are the software supposed to sell? 3.5 million as well? That doesn't make any sense. The Switch 2 has been on the market for several weeks. So has the games that has been released for it. So we don't expect any of these games to sell the same amount of units the actual hardware has. So that's just people hating, and that's just people moving the goalposts. And I'm seeing these YouTube videos of people not knowing what they're talking about. They're hearing one person say something, and then the next man run with it, and the man behind him runs with it, instead of looking at facts. As always, when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2, people always want to move the goalposts when they get proven wrong, and that's just the new goalpost right now. The Switch 2 software sales aren't selling because of the game key card situation, or that the games that released on the Switch 2 people already have and been playing on their older systems. And it's funny because, like I said, moving the goalposts once again. I've seen people would even tease me or say, oh, well, Elden Ring is not on the Nintendo Switch, Call of Duty is not on the Nintendo Switch, and whatever game they think that's on the Nintendo Switch that's going to make their system seem superior to a Nintendo system, right? So it was a problem when Elden Ring, Call of Duty, and all those games wasn't on the OG Switch. But now that they're on, well, Call of Duty is coming, but now that Elden Ring, for example, and Cyberpunk is on the Nintendo Switch 2, all of a sudden it went from, oh, those games aren't on the Switch, so that system doesn't count as a good system. Now that it's running on the Nintendo Switch 2 with no problem, oh, now it's, oh, that game is old, but it wasn't old when it was on the OG Switch. So people just love moving the goalposts, and we're living in a generation where nowadays negativity spread faster. And if you make negative videos on YouTube, you get more views and more subs. But unfortunately, on my channel, I don't do that. I'm a realist. I keep it real, 100 all the way. And that's all people are doing right now, just moving the goalposts. I mean, the games on the Switch 2 is not going to sell the same amount as the system. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But if you walk into any store, any retail store, whether it be Walmart, Target, Best Buy, you look at the Nintendo Switch 2 section, all those game key cards are gone, sold out. You may find like maybe 1 or 2 copies of each game that launch that's sitting on the store shelves, which means that those games are moving units. Now, if you're going to those retail stores and those games were packed on the shelves, then people will still say the same thing. Oh, see, I told you it's not selling. But you go into the stores, none of those Switch 2 games are on store shelves, and people still talking. People still saying it's not selling. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I just wanted to clear the air on that. And I think people already know. And this is not a channel where I'm going to be negative and just say things that doesn't make any sense for subs. I don't do that whatsoever. But if you take a look into these stores, those Nintendo Switch 2 games are sold out pretty much, because with any system, you buy the system to play games. Yes, Mario Kart, a lot of people love Mario Kart. Mario Kart sold what 70, 72 million on the OG Nintendo Switch, right? So People love that game. Mario Kart always do its thing. And a lot of people did honestly buy the Switch 2 for Mario Kart, and Nintendo knows this. But at the same time, even if you do go to the store and mind that you're gonna buy a Switch 2 just a Mario Kart, you're gonna get one or two games to accompany Mario Kart, because Mario Kart can only hold your interest but for so long. You're gonna want something new to play. Now, standing in line at a midnight launch, mostly everybody that was getting the Switch 2 bundle for Mario Kart, they also had 2 or 3 games they were picking up. I've also seen a lot of videos, and I know people personally that actually said they bought every launch title that came out for the Switch 2, right? But standing in line, people told me they're getting a Mario Kart bundle and they're getting Cyberpunk. Yes, Cyberpunk is an old game, the same game that people teased that couldn't run on the Nintendo Switch. Now they can run on the Nintendo Switch. People still went out and bought it. So CD Projekt Red is pretty much happy with the sales of Cyberpunk to the Nintendo Switch, because that game really sold out. Everybody who picked up a Switch 2 got that game alongside it. Pretty much every game that came out in the launch video with the Nintendo Switch 2, people picked up most of those games. So they did sell well. People are just moving the goalposts, making it seem like the Switch 2 software isn't selling only Nintendo games or selling or only Mario Kart. So they're painting a false narrative. That's not true. Go to your local retail store and tell me how many copies of Street Fighter you see on the shelf, Yakuza, and Bravely Default, because every store that I've been to so far, they're pretty much all sold out. You may have to just either download the game digitally or get those game gift cards, and you go home and you download it. You guys know what I'm talking about. So I wouldn't really feed into the whole narrative that the Switch 2 software didn't sell only Mario Kart. So that's a lie. That's just people moving the goalposts. Now, let's move into those game key cards that people hate so much. So I've seen YouTubers saying that the third-party games didn't sell on the Switch because of the game key card situation. That's a lie. Like I said, if you go to any retail store, all those game key cards are sold out. Me personally, I don't support them. I'm not a big fan of them. I'm more of a collector, so I like to have my games fully on cart. But even in my past videos, I've told you all that I may pick up 1 or 2, which I have. I have so far 1 game on a game key card, and that's about it. And for me, that's where it stops. So if there's a game that I like that's not fully on cartridge, then I just go ahead and get the digital version. It is what it is. Even though I'm a physical collector, I've come to grips with, hey, you know what? It's just a sign of times. Developers are greedy, they want more money, so they're going to push digital more over the cartridges. So it's either I don't buy video games at all, or to stick to my old consoles and play that, or if there's a game I really want, I have no choice but to buy the digital version, which I have no choice doing. Do I like it? No, but if that's the only way to play the game, then that's just what it is. I'm just going to buy the digital version. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. But of course, if there's always a physical cartridge, I'll always choose a physical cartridge over the digital games. But if it's not available on a cartridge, you just have to settle for the digital games. Now, the game key card situation, I don't like it at all. The only good benefit that I like about the game key cards is, say if there's a game you're interested in, you can purchase the game if you don't like it, or if it's okay. And even if you do like it and you finish the game, you can always turn around, sell it, or trade it in and get your money. And you just buy whatever game you want to buy next. So that's a good thing about it. So you're actually not stuck with those game key cards. So there is like a small benefactor to it. You understand what I'm saying? So I've seen several YouTubers, again, saying that, you need to vote with your wallets, and if you don't, I'm not going to call them the names, but I've seen a YouTuber and he actually said that if everybody stands up and don't buy those game key cards, developers are going to skip the Nintendo Switch 2, not put their games on it and whatnot. So you're actually hurting Nintendo and third-party developers for putting games on the Switch 2. That's nonsense. The Switch 1 was the best-selling system last generation. They sold more hardware and more software than both PlayStation and Xbox combined. So you actually think with the Nintendo Switch 2 off to a great start that if people stop buying those game key cards, developers aren't going to put their games on the Switch 2? Are you crazy? One of the best systems that's out? Are you crazy? If anything, it's quite the opposite. If nobody really buy those game key cards, Nintendo's gonna sooner realize that, you know what, people don't like the game key card idea. So this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna do the same thing we did with the OG Switch. We're gonna release different sizes for the Switch 2 games. So that means we're gonna get 4 gigabyte, 8 gigabyte, 16 gigabyte cartridges, or however Nintendo wants to break it down. That's pretty much what it is, because people are already speaking out that they want physical games fully on carts. And Nintendo also have came out and said that physical isn't going anywhere. All their first party titles is going to be on physical games, and they're just not going to get rid of it. So with that being said, sooner or later Nintendo's going to go ahead and start making different size cartridges for the Switch 2, because right now as it stands there's only the one 64 gigabyte cartridge. Yeah, developers brag, at least I've heard, that it costs them $4 for those game key cards, which is significantly cheaper. So if you think about it from a business perspective, even me myself would go with those game key cards. You really can't blame the developers for not using those 64 gigabyte game key cards. You have to actually blame Nintendo for that, because Nintendo are the ones that actually only have one size cartridge for their system. So you can't blame developers, you got to blame Nintendo. If Nintendo really wanted developers to have all their games on cartridges, full-fledged cartridges, they would have never created those game key cards in the first place. They would have said to the developers, hey, we want to have the 64 gigabyte cartridge and you got to use it. Either put the games on a 64 gigabyte cartridge or just make it all digital, pretty much. And like I said again, if they wanted games on cartridges, they would have did the same thing they did with the OG Switch. They would have different size cartridges for the Switch 2. Plain and simple. So Nintendo's one to blame here, not developers. You can't blame developers for something that's Nintendo's fault, and for something Nintendo provided for them as a second viable option. It's just common sense and logic. So there you go. So as far as like not supporting those game key cards, it's going to stop developers from putting their game on the Switch 2? Negative. The Switch 2 is a hotter system, just like the OG Switch was, and every developer in their mother's name are going to put games on the Switch 2. And moving forward, at the end of the year, when the Switch 2 sales pick up even further, watch how more influx games come on the system, and watch how once again the games sell more on the Nintendo Switch. Because like I said before in my last video, guys, part of the success of the OG Nintendo Switch was having those games physically on cartridge over what the competition was providing. So Nintendo's not stupid, they know this. So sooner or later they're going to make smaller size cartridges for indie developers to put their smaller titles on a cartridge. Because if a 64 gigabyte cartridge I'm hearing is $16, now I'm hearing is $17, but either way they're pretty much side by side, right? So whether it's $16 or $17 for a cartridge, and if a game is 2 gigabytes or 15, 16 gigabytes, even 20 gigabytes, I mean, it's pointless to spend all that money on a 64 gigabyte cartridge. Whereas if your game is, say, 16 gigabytes, you can just ask Nintendo for a 16 gigabyte cartridge, which in theory should be less than a 64 gigabyte cartridge. You don't want to pay for all that space, waste money on all that space that you don't need. It's just common sense, people, but that's Nintendo's fault. So moving forward, we'll see what happens. We'll see where it all goes. Maybe Nintendo might make smaller cartridge sizes. Maybe they may just continue with the game key cards. I don't know, but logic tells me if those game key cards aren't selling, that means more people are going to buy digital games from the eShop, or Nintendo's going to release smaller cartridges. And remember, as time goes on, technology gets outdated and the media becomes cheaper, the hardware becomes cheaper, the components within the hardware becomes cheaper. So the $16 gigabyte cartridge, excuse me guys, the $16 64 gigabyte cartridge today, a year, 2 years from now, even 3 years from now, might be half that price or even less. It's $4 for a game key card for developers to purchase. A couple years from now, the actual full-size cartridge may even be $4. At least the smaller cartridges like a 4 gigabyte cartridge, or 8 gigabyte, 16, etc., etc. So, what have we learned here today, guys, before I sign off? People on the internet are idiots. There's a lot of Nintendo haters out there that like to move the goalposts. I want to see Nintendo fail and spreading false information, trying to put bad propaganda on the Nintendo Switch 2, saying that the third-party software isn't selling. Definitely not true. Go walk into the game section of any store and tell me how many Switch 2 game key cards you see sitting on that shelf, and that's your answer. And remember, the software itself is not going to sell the same in line as the hardware. That doesn't make any sense. Even developers that sells an indie developer that moves 100,000 units of a digital game is successful to them, because it costs nothing to really make an indie game. So even if an indie game sells 200,000, 50,000, 300,000, pick a number, they're still making a lot of money on top, hand over fist, because it costs nothing to make a digital game. Understand what I'm saying? Even some AAA games that sell 2-3 million copies, they're considered successful to some developers. So give it time. Even if it's Switch 2, let's just say at the end of the year, move 10 to 20 million units, right? All those games that you say are old, that was on the past consoles, I'm pretty sure they'll sell 3 million and up. But even if it does later on, people are still going to move the goalposts and say, oh, only $3 million, only 3 million, they only sold 3 million copies. People are always going to talk, people are always going to always hate, people are always going to make the goalposts. And last thing I want to add before I log out, yes, I know a lot of those launch titles for the Switch 2 are old and they're on current consoles and even previous gen console. Here's the thing, there's a lot of Nintendo players out there that may not have had access to a PlayStation or Xbox, and maybe they wanted to pick it up on the Switch 2. I mean, those Xbox players, those PlayStation players, they tease Nintendo fans that Elden Ring and Cyberpunk was on the OG Switch, right? Now it's on there, and now Nintendo fans can play those games in peace with no issues. So there's always going to be a group of people out there that didn't play those games that's on the current consoles or on the previous consoles, or honestly, in my honest opinion, because I'm one of those people, may be happier playing those third-party games on a Nintendo Switch. So that's why people double dip and they triple dip. And as gamers, especially collectors, come on now, we all know this. How many times have you guys bought your favorite game several times across different platforms? So, like I said, that's just moving the goalposts once again. To be honest with you, all those third-party games that are on current consoles and previous consoles, I'd rather play all of them on a Nintendo platform, to be honest with you, because it's just more fun playing games on a Nintendo system over the competition. And that's why last generation, most third-party games that were on all platforms sold the most on a Nintendo Switch. So people have spoken. People rather play those games on a Nintendo Switch. And Nintendo, if you're paying attention to what they're doing, they're trying to corner the market. They want to have every angle covered. They want to have every single game. They want to have the games for the kids, the teens, the adults, old people, whatever. So they want a Nintendo Switch to be the one-stop system. So once every game that's on a Nintendo Switch, there will be no need to play a PlayStation. There will be no need to get an Xbox. And that's why Xbox is in the situation they're in right now. They're putting all their games on other platforms. So if I can play Xbox library of games on another platform while buying Xbox, that's why they're not selling. So that's what Nintendo's trying to do. They're trying to make it that system where it has every single game, where you don't have to go and buy a PlayStation, you don't have to go buy an Xbox. They sold 152 million last generation and this generation, they're trying to push past that. They're trying to push past 152 million. And what's the best way to do that? Make sure every single game is on your platform. We saw how the PS2 era turned out. PS2 was, I'm not going to say a phenomenal system, but PS2 was like the highest selling system. Why? Because it had pretty much every game. The Xbox and GameCube didn't have all the titles like the PS2 had. A select few, but not all. The PS2 had more games than the Xbox and the GameCube combined. So common sense is going to tell you to go and get the PS2 because every single game is on it. Same thing with Nintendo with the Switch 2. They're trying to get every single game on this platform so they can knock competition out, and less people will buy PlayStation and Xbox, and more people will buy the Nintendo Switch. And with a few launch titles that they have launched for the Switch 2, they're actually off to a really, really good start, because the Switch 1 had a terrible launch lineup. The only good game on there, honestly, was Breath of the Wild, Fast RMX, I Am Setsuna. I may be forgetting one more, but I can call all the good games that was on launch with the Switch 1, but nobody complained. You compare the Switch 2 launch with the OG Switch 1 launch, the Switch 2 had a better library out of the gate versus the OG Switch, and not to mention it's backwards compatible with the OG games with slight enhancements, and that's without a patch. So far, the only thing I dislike about the Switch 2, I don't like how Nintendo didn't hand out development kits to third-party developers so they can have all their games from the OG Switch enhanced ready for the Switch 2, because I think all of the games that released on the OG Switch should have been in 4K, 60 FPS, and 120 FPS. So far, most of the games are in 60 FPS, and the lock games are a steady lock 30 FPS, which I'm kind of done with 30 FPS games, but if it runs smooth and it's all good. But moving forward, every game needs to be 60 FPS or better, and then you start utilizing that 120 hertz FPS. But that's what I'm gonna say, guys. And if you have any comments, you know where to find me. Meet me in that comment section, baby. Red Crimson Gaming, I'm out of here. Salute to all the gamers, and stop listening to those assholes that spreading false information. Those Nintendo Switch 2 haters. That's how you know Nintendo's the best, when people start making up fake news and moving the goalposts. Peace. I'm out of here.